Thank you so much, Mohammed. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I begin in the name of God, the compassionate and merciful. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much to everyone, particularly Dr. Musharraf and his team, for all of the organizing, which I know from an organizer's perspective is never straightforward. So far, so good. And may Allah bless you for all of your efforts to do it. And I also want to note and thank the previous speakers for their really interesting, quite, I guess, depressing, but very realistic expressions. And in particular, I want to thank Toby, who I see as a great leader and an ally, a trusted friend, and we need more like him. And of course, there are more like him, but I just wanted to note that because I really do appreciate the work that he does in public and also very much behind the scenes as well. So I knew that others would be talking about the things that they've talked about. And so I wanted to perhaps bring in some different things that others haven't mentioned. And the Keep Calm and Carry On title hopefully will become more apparent as to what I mean by that towards the end as we wrap it all up. And I'll do my best to stay within my allocated 15 minutes, Mohammed Shafiq. So I think I'm going to touch really mainly on three things. The damage that has been done by extremists and what we need to do more to address that. And when I say extremists, I mean that in a very broad sense. Something around allies, and we've heard some of that already, something around the sort of common causes, and also for us as Muslims, not allowing bullies to dictate what we do and don't do on this topic. And then the Prophet, peace be upon him, his approach and the lessons that we can learn from that. So I'm going to attempt to do all of that in 15 minutes, and I'll do my best, Bismillah. So in the 90s, I converted to Islam. I chose Islam as my way of life in 1995. And I remember at the time there were efforts, projects such as Islam Awareness Week and all sorts of other things that Muslims were participating in to create materials for schools, to work with government, to try and encourage Muslims to get involved in as governors, etc., etc. And as Imam Asim mentioned earlier, the 1997 Runnymede Trust report was really when we heard that word Islamophobia. And of course, that was pre 9/11. When 9/11 happened, then of course, the whole kind of world went upside down in 2001. And Muslims were seen, of course, we know, in a very, very negative way. We had war on terror and all sorts of things that kind of fell out of that. And then in 2005, we had London bombings. 4 Muslim men blew themselves up on the London Underground, killing dozens of people and injuring dozens of others. And on our screens and our newspapers at that time, it was very much open season against Muslims. Anjem Chowdhury became a regular mainstream commentator on all channels, in all newspapers, wherever they would have him, he was there. And in my opinion, did a huge amount of damage to how Muslims and Islam were perceived by everyone. And if you remember, if you think about it, the iPhone and therefore social media didn't really come about much until 2009 or 10. And so at that time, we're talking about in the 2000s, social media wasn't a thing. So people really did get their information about Islam and Muslims pretty much from TV or newspapers. And in the mid to late 2000s, the English Defence League also emerged and rose up, marches and demos, and it was very divisive and angry and very dangerous. And again, I think that they, tapped into a fear that had been created by a lot of what I've already mentioned. And they exploited it. I think right up until 2013, Anjem Chowdhury was still being invited. I'd forgotten how recent it was actually, still being invited and given a platform more than most other Muslims were ever given a platform on mainstream TV and in newspapers. And he was really the reference point for many people about who was a Muslim and what was Islam about. That was really their reference. I don't think the government did enough then, certainly not. I don't think they really acknowledged the damage that was being done. I don't think the work around the far right at that time was good enough. I think they were allowed to, rise. I think they fed off each other. And I really think we're still feeling, I feel, the impact of all of that even now. And linked to that, of course, we've heard mentioned the stories around grooming, which is a kind of conversation of its own, of course, around child abuse and large scale groups of men doing that. And all of this was very much exploited by the EDL, the English Defence League, and others, and created even more suspicion about Muslims and Islam. And of course, the backdrop and then the drip feed of that misinformation and fear and doubt about Muslims, not just then, I'm only talking about then, of course this can go back much before that, but I just wanted to bring this in to perhaps for those of us that have forgotten about it. And I mention it because I think that it's still relevant to where we are today. In the recent report, we've heard it mentioned a couple of times on Islamophobia coming out of Birmingham. It mentions the fear and dislike and mistrust that people have of Muslims. And it also highlighted that people base this on so-called knowledge. And I think Toby certainly alluded to this, and maybe others have as well. Actually, it's more about hearsay and assumptions, not really facts. So for example, when people think about Sharia councils, for example, they think they know what they're talking about. They think they know what Sharia councils are about. Often there's a lot of lazy stereotypps. Of course, there's the odd panorama investigation here and there. And of course, then people think they know what they're about. And there we have, the stereotypes and all of that. So I just want to pick out two things from there. The stereotypes and fear of the other can often come from people not meeting the other. And this is a common issue among many different groups of people in many different countries in the world, including ours. And I think we need to think about what we as Muslims are doing to address some of the gaps that I mentioned earlier around the lack of information. Because the other thing that very much came out of this recent report was very much about people not actually knowing. So they're illiterate sometimes when it comes to actually what Islam is about and what Muslims are really about. And someone's mentioned in the chat, I noticed, we're doing all this good work. Why do people not know about it? What are we going to do about the newspapers? And of course, that is the kind of one of the $1 million questions. I also want to point out that there's very much a documented link between extremism in general, anti-Muslim hate, and that which is aimed at women or about women. And misogyny and extremism are very much linked, and it's very much something that people have spoken a lot about. And I think it's something that we have to also bear in mind. We've heard about it from people already. We heard Imran's very moving testimonies from real people that this has happened to them. I think for Muslim women, we get it from all sides, frankly. Patronizing comments from whoever, general public, prime minister, and lots of other people. There's kind of patronizing comments about poor Muslim women who need saving. Everyone calling us or telling us what we should wear, what we shouldn't wear, what we should say, what we shouldn't say, how we should speak or not speak, where we're welcome or not welcome. And this is pretty much across the board, as I mentioned, from Boris Johnson to Muslim men to the recent example on Vogue magazine, where clearly it's fashionable and trendy for someone who's an actress to wear a headscarf. That's given the thumbs up by Vogue, but when Muslim women wear it, of course, it's seen as oppressive. So I think we're, frankly speaking, Muslim women sick and tired of being at the brunt of all of this coming at us from all angles. Another point I wanted to make was about us as Muslim as allies. And this word has come up already. And we rely on allies to support us, to work with us, Bishop Toby and Gemma and so many other people. We would consider our allies, and we're grateful to them for the work that they do, speaking up and working with us, doing stuff behind the scenes. As you saw from Toby, speaking to his congregants, people who are scared and fearful, reassuring them. That kind of work is very much there. It requires a lot of patience by them, and we're very grateful for that. And I think we as Muslims have to ask ourselves, what are we doing for others? Are we allies for other people? Is it enough for us to just think that people need to understand what Islamophobia is and the definitions and all of those things, which are, of course, very important, but is it enough? And in the same report that we're talking about, I just wanted to mention, because I think it's important, that in fact, gypsy travelers they're seen as the most hated and the most misunderstood and the most kind of, things around them. It's always negative. They're very much a misunderstood group of people. And of course, then hate crime stats. So we've heard already that from Imran that the stats from a religious hate crime perspective, Muslims are the highest, and then it's Jews after that. But to just let us all just remember that hate crime statistics in general overall, issues around disability hate crime is very high, higher than we should all feel okay with. It's embarrassing and a disgrace to our country that we have that much hate crime against disabled people, LGBT people, of course, anti-Semitism, racism itself. And of course, for some people, and I feel like it's been mentioned, and I'll mention it as well, that, you know, for someone who's, for example, a Black Muslim, the layers of racism and then Islamophobia, and then might be a Muslim woman in a headscarf, you know, there's all sorts of layers of discrimination that that person has to navigate. And it has been noted, and I will mention it because people have messaged me that, you know, for these kind of discussions, we need to make sure that we include Black Muslims in these kind of conversations as well. I think that's very important for us to all to be reflecting on that. It's not to deny that the anti-Muslim prejudice is real. Of course it's real. We've heard it. I've experienced it myself throughout my time of being a Muslim, and many people I know have as well. I just think that we need to keep it in perspective and always keep it in the frame of the rest of the country, and for us to not, you know, be too inward looking, because I think that can also be dangerous. And think about, you know, in our communities, when someone wants to speak up about LGBT issues or wants to stand with the Jewish community against anti-Semitism, for example, and other issues, they're often attacked by Muslims themselves and bullied and labeled in a certain way. And of course, that is very, very unhelpful and doesn't do any of us any good at all. And I've been at the receiving end of that, and many other people I know, and I would say particularly Muslim women, really feel the brunt of that whenever they try and speak out against issues. We often attack each other, which I find very unhelpful, and it makes it very difficult. And I think then we, if we want to challenge the stuff in our own communities as well as wider society, if we want people to stand with us, then we need to not feel fearful of calling out the bad stuff on our doorstep, lifting the rug up and talking about some of the difficult things without thinking that it's going to make it worse, that Islam is somehow going to be, you know, made to be worse. Actually, if crimes are being committed, if people are being mistreated and there's injustice in Muslim communities, then we as Muslims need to own that stuff and feel okay about talking about it without, you know, feeling that we always need to be closed down because somehow we'll make Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred even worse. I think that we can't, as I say, we can't stop doing that, and people shouldn't stop us talking about these issues. And what are we doing to fill the gap when it comes to understanding of Islam and Muslims? You know, what are we doing about that? And I mentioned earlier, you know, there's good work happening. I'm not saying there isn't good work happening. And when someone like me mentions this stuff, it's not about acknowledging that good work is happening. Of course it is. But it's about what more can we do? You know, we've heard it in this report. We've heard it in other reports as well. I remember seeing a report in early 2000s about, you know, the misconceptions of Muslims and the lack of information that people have about Islam. They just take it from whatever they see. And I've given some examples of all of that. We need to think about what are we going to do to redress that balance. Is it going to be working more in schools, for example? Is it going to be working more with other communities to try and get this message out of what our faith, our beautiful faith, is actually about? You know, are we going to create better quality resources to teach people about our faith? I think there's some good stuff online. There's not enough. And I think that we, you know, there's really is a gap there that some of us need to fill. I think we need to acknowledge our own stuff, as I've mentioned, and to really be compassionate, to think about the stuff think about it from this, you know, if a Muslim, even if it is one person, does something bad and calls out Allahu Akbar in the most horrendous way, and our heart sinks, as we all know as Muslims, when something like terrible like that happens, and we know that there's going to be a backlash, and we know there'll be a spike in hate crime, etc. How do we see it, and how can we put ourselves in the shoes of others and remember that how fearful they feel and how it makes people feel? How does it make someone like my mum feel? Someone like her watching the news, taking all of this in, wondering, can I trust my Muslim neighbor? How do I relate to Muslims? Of course, it's one person, but we need to show compassion. You know, if we think about what happened recently when the guy traveled from Blackburn to the US, bought a gun and held a rabbi and his congregants hostage for 11 hours. We need to have compassion. We need to understand that the Jewish community need to know that we stand with them. At moments like that, Jewish parents are feeling fearful that their children are going to go to school and something's going to happen. So as Muslims, we know we have to show compassion at moments like that and not just put our defenses up and say, well, it was just one person, he had mental health issues, and pray for him that he goes to, you know, somehow is forgiven for his sins. that stuff just doesn't work for people. So I think I just want to finish off by saying, you know, can we be good allies as well as Muslims? We want people to stand with us. I really feel that, and that's right, and that's happening, and we need it to happen even more. But what are we going to do as allies? How are we going to stand with others when they are also facing discrimination? There's not a hierarchy of hatred here. It can't be one form of hatred is worse than another. We have to see all of this in the context of the wider picture and our whole, you know, our country as a whole. And I just want to finish here by saying that we're, you know, it's so easily we can become victims and a victimhood mindset. And of course, we've heard the stuff is terrible and it's very difficult, and we know all of that. But let's not become those that focus only on those things, because that stops innovation, it destroys creativity, it stops us from progressing and moving forward as the beautiful community that we know we are, and we can be even better in the future. So yes, there are issues. We need to call out the media. We need to monitor what's happening. We need academics like Imran and others to continue to do the reports they're doing. But what about the rest of us? What are we going to do then? You know, we know that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, when he went from Mecca to Medina, and look at how much discrimination they faced in that part of time. It's horrendous. We all know the stories, and arguably much worse than many of us have ever faced. And God willing, will never face that kind of discrimination and oppression and attacks and physical attacks and all of it. What was one of the first things that he said when he went into Medina? Peace and blessings be upon him. Spread peace, feed the people, pray at night, and keep the ties of kinship. I think to myself, if we as Muslims and others around us could just do these 4 things, the country would be a much better place. So I think that the Prophet didn't then organize gatherings of lots of people to tell each other every week how bad this all is. He didn't do that. They acknowledged how bad it was. They all knew how bad it was. What he did was he led with love and compassion, and he was inclusive, including in his mosques, allowing everyone in. Everybody was part of it. People loved him, peace be upon him, for what he stood for and how he lived his faith. So that's why I say my title of my talk is Keep Calm and Carry On, because really God really does know everything. Thank you so much for listening.